What's up, guys? Welcome to the API functions section. In this video, we're going to go over all the loading functionality you can get with maci, specifically loading files and strings that are formatted in the maci language. We're also going to talk about some of the different parameter options you can get within the API functions, and of course, how to import maci and how to access all those functions. So here we are in our main.py file that we're using as an example. And the first thing I want to show is how to import maci. Now in the intro video, it actually talks about how to install maci, so you can watch that on how to install it, just in case you haven't yet. But once it's installed, all you're simply going to do is type import maci. Now this is if you install the full version of maci, and the full version of maci, the way you would know that you've installed that is if you hover over it, you'll see the flavor says maci. If you're not familiar with the different flavors, there's 3 flavors of maci. Anyways, in the course of this series, we're just going to be working with the full version, which if you just install maci, that'll come with everything. So as you can see, the information in here just shows some basic information like the version. You can also find like where to go to find the tutorials and docs. And then you can also find the source code. And the reason why I brought this up is throughout maci's functions and methods, you're going to find some helpful documentation in there just to get more information, especially if you're using an IDE that can detect that. All right, so now we have maci officially imported. So let's see how we can access these API functions. So I'm going to go to a couple new lines here. And maci was designed to be very simple, as mentioned in the intro video. So really, all you have to do to access the API functions is just to simply type maci dot using the dot notation, and then here's all of your API functions. Literally everything that we're going to be going through in this whole series is all available here. And you see they all have alphabetized naming conventions, so you can quickly find or look for specific sections. So if you're trying to get to the JSON, which we're not going to go over, you'll see all the JSON stuff loads, and then XML. Now, the only thing that's not really alphabetized is the maci specific tooling. So you can kind of assume that if it doesn't have like a specific name like XML or YAML, then that's going to be more primitive or native to maci itself, which I'm going to go over each function for maci specifically. And of course, you can find them all in the documentation as well, organized for easy finding. But just as a quick comparison, if you wanted to look for like the load function, which we're going to go over shortly, you could just type load. And automatically you should know like this is for maci because it's native to this module. Versus if you type JSON load, you know that's specific to loading JSON. I just want to make that clear so you can understand the distinction. So the first function that we're going to gain access to is the build function, probably one of the most simplest functions in the maci library. The build function allows you to generate an empty maci data object. And so when I call this function, and we can hover over it here, you see it returns a maci data object. And it even tells you, gives you helpful information that this returns an empty maci data object. Now, there is a dedicated section that talks about the maci object and how to build out your object and how to assign names and values. And I might show a little bit of that in this section, but the more comprehensive and detailed breakdown of all that, which includes understanding how to use maci's methods as well, is going to be found in the object section. So I highly recommend watching that section if you want to understand how to utilize maci's data object after loading and even dumping data. But for this section, we're just sticking with understanding how to load data from files and strings in the different formats that are returned and how to dump the data as well. And you'll be able to see, I am going to show a little bit of the object just to see what the data looks like. All right, let's go ahead and assign this output to a variable. And this should give us an empty maci data object. So I'm going to go ahead and just say like maci data, make it equal to that. And I'm going to use our handy print function to go ahead and see what this looks like. So what does it look like when you get a maci data object or an empty one back? Let's go ahead and print this. You see it printed on the bottom here. This is what an empty maci data object looks like. Now, when there's actual data in here, you're going to see the names and value pairs. You can also think of it as key value pairs, but names and value pairs, really it's the attribute names assigned to values inside of this object. So that's how you build a fresh maci data object. Let's go on to the next part, and that's loading a maci formatted file so you can finally import your data. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and keep this same variable, but we're going to go ahead and update our function now to load, maci.load. All you need to do is supply the file path to your file with the maci formatted data. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable just to keep it easy and organized. We're just going to go file name equals, and we're already in the same location that we're at now. Now you could apply relative paths and absolute paths, whatever you want to do to your file. But because we're in the same directory already, I should be able to just do test.save, which is our game save file. And maybe we'll go ahead and update this name just to make it a little bit more fun. I don't know why I can't type today. We'll do mygame.save and call it that. So let's go ahead and rename this. Call it mygame.save. Okay, so quick recap on the data inside of there. You know, we have this file, which we used in the last section of the language section. We're going to continue to use this for our examples, but we should be able to import all this data using the maci.load function and gain access to it inside of our code. I'm going to go ahead and leave this off to the side just so we can kind of reference it back and forth as needed. So let's go ahead and load it. All you would simply do is now just type your file path. You don't have to do a variable, of course, but I just want to do it for completeness. And so now when I print this maci data object, we should see, which this came from the build, right, which was empty. But now we should actually see a fully loaded maci data object full of data. And if you hover over this, you do see there's multiple parameters, which we are going to go over in this video. But you see at the end here, it actually returns a maci data object full of the data. So let's go ahead and run that. And so now you see this maci data object. It's quite full of data right now. But as I described earlier, you'll see the names equaling their values. So here's our username, you know, the very first name we see in the file. And so it's equaling that string. And we see our integer name and then our money and then all these, you know, values or names and values following suit. So that's simply how you would load a file, any kind of plain text file with data structured using maci's format, which, as described before in the language section, this really feels native and it's really just styled after Python. So if you're used to writing Python data, you can simply write it in a plain file and load it without issue. And that's what makes maci's probably most desired feature, is just the ability to write native Python data inside of a plain text file and to easily load it as your configuration data or save data in this context. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, how do you access the data? Now, this is more described inside of the object section because it also talks about all the features you can use. But just to give an example, let's go ahead and just access the first value. So if you're already comfortable with using Python's dot notation to access attributes, that's simply exactly what you would do. So if you type dot username and then run it, you should get the string back. And we do. So we see the Johnny88. When I print this and run this, we see Johnny88 was printed, which is the string. And if I were to go to something like inventory, same thing. You get all of your inventory items. And of course, if you want to access it, simply just put in the key name and we can go ahead and access some of the sub values there. So really think of this, everything is being converted to a real Python object, right? So you can access them just like Python objects. There's nothing foreign about it. If you're used to accessing Python data, then it's a one-to-one experience. So I think you pretty much understand at this point. If not, I would definitely go to the documentation just to get a better deep dive. But that's how simple it is to load your file. So let's go ahead and move on to understanding some of the different parameters. So when we hover over here, we're going to see there's different parameters. The first positional argument, right, is just your file path or your file name. And maci also accepts path objects. If you're not sure what a path object is, I would look up the documentation. It has referral links on what a path object is, but it also accepts native path objects. But the next thing I want to go over is the attribute name deduplication. So this parameter allows you to disable attribute name deduplication. For this function specifically, and I think a few others, it's on by default. And of course you're wondering, what is that? So attribute name deduplication, again, on by default, this protects your attribute names from, well, being duplicated inside of a file. So if there's a second attribute name inside of this file, let's just use username as the easiest example here. If there's already an existing username found in this file, and then you try to reassign it again, or maci finds that it's trying to load another attribute name with the same name already again, it's actually going to throw an exception and block it from loading this file. So if I run this again, run the code again, here's our exception. It says name already pre-exists, must give unique attribute names in file. And so we see it's talking about which file we're talking about that it had trouble with, at what line number, and it actually tells you the attribute name that it had an issue with, which is extremely helpful. So this is very important to protect against overwriting variable names inside of your file or attribute names inside of your file. So every single, you can imagine at this point, every single name has to be unique. Of course, you could just add numbers if you need to, or add underscores, but either way, every single name has to be unique inside of your file. So that's a very important feature, especially when loading large data sets, having thousands of names where it may be hard to keep track. So this is a very important security protection feature for your data in the file. Now, of course, you can turn this off. I don't know why you ever would. I think it's important to always have a dedicated name for your data, but you can turn this off in case you want to. The API does expose that to be turned off if needed. Maybe you have a unique situation, I don't know. The next parameter I want to talk about is encoding. If you understand encoding, you probably understand what this is. If you don't understand encoding, then I would just ignore it entirely. Now, the default is set to none, and that's totally fine. The default uses, whatever the default of Python is. So you don't really have to use this, but you can if the data is using a specific codec. But 95% of the time, everyone's using the default codec, which is UTF-8. But anyways, if you do have a specific use case, use this parameter to load the data with the desired codec of the encoded data if needed. And that's talking about the entire file being encoded in a specific codec. So I'm only going to mention that once, and that applies for all loading within maci. Now, this last parameter, the API does expose it, and it does allow you to disable it. Now, currently it is enabled, and it's a little bit confusing because it's using a double negative where it says ignore maci adder check, and we're saying false. We actually don't want to turn that off. We actually want to leave it on. But if you do set it to true, then it's going to ignore the maci attribute check. So what does this mean? There's internal maci attributes being used that may be possible to actually create a name that matches. So if you happen to create a name that matches, maci's actually going to throw an exception and not allow you to load that name. Now you might be thinking, that's kind of stupid. I wouldn't want that experience. But let me just give you some assurance. The chances of creating that name is going to be next to none. It's a very long name, and it's very unique to maci. But if you ever do encounter it, and if you absolutely need that name, you can totally turn this off and load that name in. But it will overwrite the internal name. But maybe you need that for some reason. I have no idea, and I highly recommend to not do that, truthfully. This will protect you against that. In fact, this is a second layer of protection. The first layer is the attribute name deduplication. All the internal maci attribute names get generated before it even begins to load your data. And so this will actually fire off first before this actually happens. So truthfully, if there's a pre-existing name, I would just suggest to name it slightly different if you happen to have the same name. Okay, since we're already here, I decided to quickly go ahead and grab the name just to show and demonstrate to you what it looks like. So this is what one of the names look like. So you see they're pretty long, and they are dunder names, and that comes after what's called the maci data object constructor. Not going over that at all, but the chances of you writing a name like this in your file, probably next to none. But if you did encounter yourself having to write a exact name like this, then of course you can disable that if needed, but I highly suggest you just rename so you don't overwrite the internal name. And I should have mentioned this, but if you do happen to write that name, you would need to disable this and enable this in order to make that happen. So the next load function we're going to go over is called load adders. Let's go ahead and type that in. So we'll just add adders. And we're actually going to drop the variable. And we'll remove the print statement for now. So if you hover over load adders, this actually doesn't return anything. Let me explain. So load adders might be actually a highly desirable function of maci, because what it does is it loads maci formatted data like you see over here, but it loads it inside of your own custom object. So just to give an example, let's go ahead and create a dummy class here and instantiate our object. And let's just call this, let's just say this is your custom class object, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and just say my data, and I'm going to go ahead and instantiate it. So if we hover over this, we'll go ahead and see it takes two required positional arguments, a file name and a class object. So we have our file name already. Let's go ahead and put in our instantiated object. What's going to happen is maci is going to load all these attributes with the exact same data and load it in place inside of this custom object. And so if I were to take our print function and now take our custom object, right? And let's just grab username. And we need to remove this duplicate. Almost forgot about that. And now if we just access username and print this and run this, look what we get. We get our string. Now you can imagine the benefit behind this. If you have a custom object and you actually want to store data from that object to a file, which is talked about in the dump section as well, you can actually reload your data back into your custom object using this special load adders function. And this can be extremely helpful if there's certain data sets or data you have in an object that you want to store to a file temporarily and then update it over time, or just save to a file and, load it back up when you need to. This is a very useful function that allows you to easily store or allows you to easily load data from a file back into your custom object. This doesn't allow you to use any of the native maci features, like the locking, for example. And if you haven't seen that, just go to the language section. But you can't use the locking, you can't use any of this. All that functionality gets stripped away and is just loaded straight into your object without any of that functionality because, well, you're using your own custom object. You're not using a maci data object. But every single attribute name you see in here is all loaded into this custom object for your access without issue. Now, if we hover over it, we can take a quick look at the other parameters. I've already gone over these in the load function, so I would just go to the previous part on talking about load and just get an understanding of what these means, but it's exactly the same thing. The only difference is that attribute name deduplication is actually disabled. This was disabled on purpose because this is dealing with someone's custom object data, right? And so we don't know the context of the custom object data that's needed. So we pretty much left it up to the developer to protect against their names being deduplicated. But of course, this is exposed in the API. So you can, of course, enable this if you need to. And so, it's a keyword argument. All you would do is just type that and just do true. Pretty straightforward. So that's load adders, extremely useful if you have custom objects and you want to load data formatted in the Python styled maci format, and you can load it into your own object. So now we have load raw. What does that do? Hopefully the name is self-explanatory enough, but essentially it just loads file data raw. Has nothing to do with parsing the names or anything. It's literally just a convenience function. So instead of writing your own custom file handling functions, this is the benefit of having this function where you can just simply load data raw from a file and not have to write very common or repetitive code for simply loading file data. The partner function for this is also dump raw, so you can see that in the dump section. So again, keeping it straightforward for common use cases like loading raw data and dumping raw data. So if we hover over this, we see load raw. Its only positional argument is file name, so you simply just supply a file name, and then you can load the raw data. So if I run this and print it, let's go ahead and bring this up here. You can see this is literally just printing the raw data that's existing inside of this file. So nothing special there, but this is just printing the raw data in there. And I should have mentioned that what this returns is a string. And so it returns a string by default, but it can also return byte data. And in order to access byte data, it's just simply enabling the byte data parameter. So if we just say byte data true and run this, this will return the data in its original representation, right? And so if you need byte data to be loaded from a file, you can just simply enable that switch, and then you can load byte data. So that's really it when it comes to load raw. Very straightforward function, but extremely useful. And again, encoding, go back to the load part of this video to talk about what encoding is. All right, so the last load function for just handling maci specific data within a file is load dict. So let's go ahead and access that. So we'll go ahead and just do load dict. We'll need a file name. If you've already guessed, this is going to load maci formatted data and return a dictionary of all the attribute names and values, which is really just giving you key names and value pairs, or key value pairs. And so if we hover over this, the only positional parameter, again, is a file name, and all we have to do is run this. And as you can imagine, as soon as we run this, we can actually just view, we'll actually get all of this data back in a dictionary format. So if we run this, there we are. You see the username, which is the string, and then the other key name starting score, which has our integer. So as you can imagine, and again, as you're used to accessing data in Python, all you have to do is just say, I want to access username like this, and that'll give you the value back with the string. Some people prefer their data to be returned like a dictionary like that, and so you totally could do that if you want to ignore the maci functionality entirely. And again, as you can imagine, this would ignore like locking and everything. That functionality gets stripped entirely because we're using a native Python dictionary. Now, if we hover over this, there's not really any other functionality to talk about. Of course, you have your attribute name deduplication that is actually enabled. So if you want to disable that, you can, but I think it was kind of self-explanatory to leave it enabled, because if you already understand Python dictionaries, if you have the same key name will be overwritten anyway. So this was enabled by default just as an extra protection to kind of signal you to watch out for that. But other than that, if you want to find out about encoding, again, go back to the first talk about maci.load. All right, so at this point, this brings us to loading maci data in a string format. So I'm going to go ahead and create 3 variables or 3 attribute names inside of a string. All right, so I jumped ahead to just go ahead and create it for you real quick. And so as you can see, I just took, the top 3 attribute names and created a string, which kind of followed some of our older examples inside of the language section of the videos. And so we still have our comment in there just to demonstrate that this ignores comments. But also we have all of our true attribute names, and we have this backslash here. This is going to escape a new line, the first new line character, so you don't have an extra line at the top of your data. Now that's really just useful if you're dumping this to a file, but I kind of do it by convention. But anyways, this should parse your data just like it would in a file, including the maci specific features, which is the locking. And if we go ahead, I already wrote it here, but you see load stir, which is load string. And so this should return a maci data objects, just like you would expect from load, but of course it's loading it from string data. So if we go ahead and type this string data, and then if we print this, we should see a maci data object with all of our individual names and values together. So if I run this, there they are, username, Johnny, and then we have the starting score, their integer, and then of course our floating point value. And again, if you want to access these, you would just simply type their attribute names. If I run this, you see now Johnny's being printed. And so if you have a reason to store your data in a string, which I demonstrated in the language section, there might be multiple reasons to do that. Even I do it myself. You can do it like that. Now, you can also express your string in line, which you'll have to add the new line characters in there. I would watch the string video again just to kind of go over that, just to understand how to write an inline string. But that's pretty much the load string function. It does have the attribute name dedupe. It's literally treating it the same as the load function, with a little bit less parameters needed to read a file. But that's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward. We're pretty much at the end of this video at this point. We have the last load function to show you, which is the load string dict. So simply just add dict for dictionary at the end, and this is exactly what you'd expect, just like you saw from load dict, but it's load string dict. So we're literally just passing our string data, but this time it's not returning a maci data object, right? It's returning a dictionary. And I forgot to show that load dict returns a dictionary, but that's exactly what it's going to do as the return data. So if I run this now, you'll see now all of our data from this string is represented in a dictionary format. Of course, there's no maci features at all. Even if the lock is in here, it's not actually going to work. It'll still parse this, and I forgot to mention that earlier. This will still get parsed, but it's only going to drop, it's going to drop this whole feature and just give you the regular assignment. It's not going to add anything, and in fact, it wouldn't work anyway because this is a Python dictionary object like I mentioned before, and that doesn't have the maci built-in features. So, of course, if you want to access it, it's a dictionary, so run that, put in the key name, username, and we can access our string. Now, as far as any extra parameters to go over, same thing, attribute name dedupe. I've already explained what this is, so I think you get the idea. But that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for the load section in this series. But hopefully this video was helpful to you and explain some of the useful abilities you can access within the maci library regarding loading files and loading from strings. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.